Hi, my name is Summer with Summerly Design Co. I am an obsessive sock knitter and I design sock knitting patterns. In this tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to knit a Forethought heel. Really simple, really fun to do, so let's get to it. I have now reached the point in my pattern where it is time to insert the line of waste yarn where my Forethought heel is eventually going to go. So the first thing that I have to do is to work in pattern across the first half of my stitches. And what that means is that I have 64 total stitches on my needles. So I need to work in pattern across 32 stitches. This particular round of my chart is pretty easy. It's just a simple knit round in this mustard color. So I am going to knit 32 stitches in this mustard color, and that makes up half of my 64 stitches. If you think of the construction of a sock, I'm going to pull this in. You can see that this is like the first half of your stitches. This is the back half. The first half is the fabric that rests on top of your foot. The remaining half of your stitches is the fabric that rests on the bottom. It's the sole of your sock. So when you think about inserting a heel, these first half of my stitches, that's the top of my foot. The remaining half of my stitches make up the bottom of my foot, or where I would put the heel. So that's why I am working across the first half of my stitches. This is what's going to eventually rest on the top of my foot. And so that's why we work across the first half, and then we work our Forethought heel on the remaining half of our stitches. And again, for me, I've got 64 total stitches on my needle. So I am working in pattern up to 32 stitches. All right, I have now completed that first part of the heel placement instruction. I have worked in pattern across the first half of my stitches, and the remainder of my stitches I haven't done anything to on this round. So the next part of the instruction is to grab some waste yarn to knit in a line of waste yarn. I typically like to get a color that is wildly different from the colors that I'm using, just because it stands out and it makes it a lot easier to see when you go to work the heel. So I'm working with a lot of mustards and pinks. So I chose this very dark blue because it's going to contrast really, really well against my pattern. And that way I'll be able to see it really, really easily. So we're going to take our waste yarn, and all we're going to do is knit the remaining half of our stitches in the waste yarn. And I like to leave a very long tail. That way we know it's not going to come undone. So just kind of, about 6 inches or so. Leave yourself a long tail. And then we're just going to knit. Very, very simple. I'm just going to knit the remainder of my stitches. That's 32 stitches in the waste yarn. So when all is said and done, I will have 32 stitches, the first half of my stitches, knit in pattern in the color I'm supposed to be using. And then the remaining half of my stitches, the remaining 32 stitches, will be knit in this waste yarn. And the waste yarn's eventually going to come out, but for now, it's going to hold in place where our heel is going to go. So I'm going to go ahead and knit the rest of these stitches until I reach the end of the round. All right, I've now reached the end of the round. Here's my little marker that marks the beginning of round. I've now reached the end. All of the rest of my stitches in this round are on the waste yarn. The next part of the instructions are to get all of these waste yarn needles back onto my left-hand needle so that I can work them again. And this part's really easy. All we're going to do is that last waste yarn stitch we knit, we're going to slip it onto our left-hand needle and just keep going. You're just going to slip all of those waste yarn stitches from the right needle back to the left. So I am just inserting my left-hand needle into that stitch and bringing it back to the left needle, getting it off the right needle. So I'm going to keep doing that until I get all the waste yarn stitches back. And just the waste yarn. Do not slip any of the first half of your stitches, just the waste yarn stitches. All right, I have now taken all of my waste yarn stitches and put them back on my left-hand needle, and now I can knit them. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the tail through to the front so it dangles down in the front. Now I'm going to take my working yarn that I'm using for my pattern, and I am going to continue working in pattern, pick up right where I left off. I was on round 1 of my chart. My instructions for round 1 of my chart were to knit a solid round in this mustard color. So I'm going to keep doing that. So you basically just pick up where you left off in your instructions and you finish out the round. Now I'm just knitting on this waste yarn. And you would just keep doing that all the way to the end of the round. All right, I have now finished working that chart round. See how I knit across I worked across all of the strands of waste yarn. Now I'm done with that round, and I am going to pull that tail through and snip it, and again keep kind of a long tail, just we don't want it to come out. So now, as you can see, move all these strands of yarn out of the way. As you can see, we now have a strand of waste yarn knit into the back half of these stitches. Eventually, I'm going to come back when I finish the sock and show you how, but we're actually going to be putting our needles back in these stitches and then teasing out this waste yarn. So that's it. That is how you insert waste yarn to knit an eventual heel in this spot. Super easy. I'm going to finish this sock and then I will come back and show you how we're going to knit this heel and get these stitches back on our needles. All right, I've now finished my sock, and what we should have is a long tube pressed flat with your toe at one end, your cuff at the other, and it should be facing so that your waste yarn strand that you knit in is facing up at you. And again, it's really helpful to use a color of waste yarn that is vastly different from what you knit with so that it stands out and it's really easy to see. So now the next step is to get these stitches on either side of our waste yarn back on our needles so that we have live stitches on our needles ready to knit. And it's really easy to do that. I'm going to show you how. All right, so first you are going to identify your first waste yarn stitch, and then you're going to pick the stitch directly below that and insert your needle into the right leg of that stitch. Next, you're going to insert your needle into the right leg of the second stitch, and then the third stitch. And you're just going to keep doing that all the way down until you have half your stitches on the needle. So again, I have 64 stitches total for my sock, so half is 32. So I want to keep inserting my needle into the right leg of every stitch below my waste yarn stitches until I have 32 stitches on my needle. So I'm just going to keep going down the line, and you can see it's pretty simple. You're just inserting your needle into that right leg of the stitch that is directly below your waistline, your waste yarn stitches. Keep going. Right. Okay, then you turn your sock around. I've now got half my stitches on the needles on one side of my waste yarn line, and now I need to get the second half of my stitches, which rest on the other side of the waste yarn line. I need to get those on my needles, and so we just repeat the same process. We are just inserting our needle into the right leg of each stitch below the line of waste yarn. now have all of my stitches picked up on either side of my waist yarn, my waist yarn. My live stitches are now on the needles, and now all we have to do is just get rid of the waist yarn. Really simple to do. We're just going to pick it out. I just use my tapestry needle, and all you're doing is just pulling up to pull it out. It's actually really satisfying. So we're just going to keep doing that until we have all of our waist yarn out of there. All right, I pulled my waist yarn out. Now you see I've got a gaping hole with my live stitches on my needles, and I am now ready to join in my yarn and knit. The instructions for knitting your heel are in your pattern. Just follow that. Forethought and Afterthought heels are knit exactly how you knit toes, so just follow the instructions in your pattern. But hopefully this tutorial helped you understand how to place the waist yarn and then how to get your needles back on the live stitches once you're ready to knit the heel.